All right. So, Seb, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Oh man, it's honestly my pleasure. I think we spoke about it just before jumping or hitting record, and that is that Bitcoin community just never ceases to amaze me. You jump on these calls and you meet so many like-minded individuals, and you align on so many different levels. But even if you don't align, you're able to have these great conversations because you realize people have they've done that proof of work. They've put time and energy into forming their opinions, and so you're curious about, why are you thinking that way? I'd love to learn more about how you got to that decision.
Totally agree with you there. And yeah, let's dig into that because that's the goal of this podcast, right? Is to learn a bit more about yourself and how you stumbled upon Bitcoin because everybody's journey is different, right? And so for me, I'd love to kick off the podcast, and if you wouldn't mind, just kind of sharing with me a bit what I like to call, your Bitcoin origin story, if you will. So how did you discover Bitcoin? And you can go as far back as you like, but just what you think is relevant to kind of your Bitcoin origin story.
For sure. So, you know what? I was on Currencies podcast, Once Bitten, a little while back. This is probably about 2 years ago. And we were discussing this idea of pre-Bitcoin orange pill moments, where you're getting orange pilled before Bitcoin was even around. And it's these kind of bricks that led to building that foundation that allowed you to understand Bitcoin or see Bitcoin for what it was. And for me personally, I would say there's a few events that have really shaped who I am from childhood that in hindsight, I look back on them and they very much laid those bricks, that foundation for me to understand Bitcoin. So the first one was when I was probably about 5 years old, my parents separated. And because my parents separated, it meant that my mum had to effectively raise my two brothers and I and put a roof over our heads and put food on the table. And our monetary environment plays a huge role in that. If you've got one single parent trying to support the whole family, if we've got a very hard monetary environment where she's having to work more, all of a sudden she wasn't able to meet our emotional needs to the extent that she might have been able to in a world on maybe sound money. And so this was huge. When I look back in hindsight, I started to realize, our monetary environment shapes our parents' ability to meet our emotional needs as children. And ultimately, that impacts our development and all of these other byproducts, how we show up in the world. That's kind of like the first point that I really started to realize, money is very powerful. So do we live in a world where money meets our needs, or are we living in a world where money can do the best good that it can possibly do? The second point I would say is when I was about 9 years old, there was a scooter that I really wanted. And I'd saved for this scooter in this toy store for about 3 months. And I put all of my blood, sweat, and tears into saving for the scooter. And we ended up walking into the scooter, into the toy store with my dad and my two brothers and I. And we went to go purchase the scooter. And he says, I feel bad that you're getting the scooter and your two brothers aren't. And so he ended up paying for my two brothers' scooters and I had to pay for mine. And I was just fuming. I was so frustrated that I'd worked so hard for the scooter, and all of a sudden I'm paying for mine and my brothers are getting one for free. And what's interesting is in economics, there's something called the Cantillon effect. And the Cantillon effect is those who are closest to the monetary spigot benefit disproportionately. In other words, those closest to the money printer benefit disproportionately. Well, on a family level, my two brothers were much closer to my dad, and so they benefited disproportionately. And what's interesting is when I look at their trajectory now as they're grown up and we're kind of adults, they are much more socialist and much more interventionistic, given that they've had a lot more handouts throughout their life. Whereas I tend to lean a lot more Austrian economics, much more libertarian, and I believe that intervention is not the answer. So you can start to see how intervention impacts, again, how we show up in the world. And so that's another point that looking back in hindsight, it shaped how I start to view the world. Do I believe in intervention or do I believe in handouts? Do I believe in intervention and handouts, or do I believe in allowing things to unfold and allowing people to kind of learn and develop the skills to be able to support themselves? And then my final point that I'll quickly mention is my first love was mountain biking. I was absolutely enamored by mountain biking. From about 8, 9 years old, I started to get into mountain biking. I watched all of the mountain bike movies. I used to see the Tiger Woods of the mountain bike world on all of these movies on the big screen. And then I ended up moving to Canada and I started teaching mountain biking. When I started teaching mountain biking, I quickly realized, I am struggling here. It is hard to pull in a wage to support myself doing something I love, even when I'm working 6, 7 days a week. And not only that, but I'm working with my idols that I used to see in these movies. And these idols are up to their neck in debt. They are struggling to afford a place to live. Most of them are renting. And it made me recognize that our monetary environment, again, impacts our ability to show up how we want to show up. And these individuals that are world renowned, they're on the world stage winning competitions, they're in all the movies, they're struggling to survive. And so I quickly pivoted and recognized that, okay, if I want to teach mountain biking, I have to have some passive income streams. I have to have some form of income that supports me so that I can teach mountain biking. And so I started investing. And I started investing in real estate to start. And I slowly started building my little real estate portfolio. And then I started investing in the financial markets, trading stocks, trading a few options and futures. And I always believed that we were in a free market. I believe that value rises to the top. And when there's hard times, those that have been fiscally irresponsible and unproductive will wither away. And so as I'm investing in these companies and as I'm investing in real estate, what I'm believing is that we're in this free market. But then each time we go through these corrections, all of a sudden, the central bank steps in and they artificially suppress interest rates. People were able to obtain capital and borrow beyond their means. And all of a sudden, these growth stocks rocket and these value stocks that I've been investing in tend to collapse. And then you would also see the same thing with real estate. Going into, especially the pandemic, I had a little property nearby and I sold the property in December of 2019 because I felt like the economy was on its knees and it was very unstable. And I felt as if we were about to go through a major correction. So I ended up selling my property, a little kind of apartment. Then we went through the pandemic and I was just like, my God, I timed the market perfectly. This is awesome. And then we saw the central bank step in and I saw housing prices. The house that I sold now is almost triple what I sold it for. And we've gone through arguably one of the biggest impacts to society in the last 20 years, and house prices have tripled. They haven't gone down. And so it very much made me realize we do not live in a free market. We live in a market with a lot of intervention. And this intervention maybe isn't supporting us in the way that we believe it is. And so those kind of moments really got me questioning. I'd say they really kind of cemented that foundation for understanding Bitcoin on a deeper level. It was kind of a mixture of the monetary side of things, a mixture of the childhood trauma psychology side of things. And that's what I think is so incredible about Bitcoin is Bitcoin really is for everyone. And you can look at Bitcoin through so many different lenses. And so that's kind of, I would say, a bit of my origin story.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. There's a lot of key points that you made there, and I think one of them, which I think is very interesting, and I think once you learn more about Bitcoin, you do stumble down Austrian economics and what that means, and the free markets, and because I think when we're young, and I think you kind of had this, I guess, moment of realization when you met some of your idols from the mountain biking world is when you're young, I think you have the naivete that you think, okay, I grow up, I start making money, I can afford a house, I can do this, I can do that. And maybe 50, 60 years ago that was the case, but I think now I also realize that as I started to get older is that most people are like you said, in debt up to their eyeballs, enslaved into debt and different types of financial trappings, if you will. And for a lot of people, that causes a lot of stress. There's a lot of market behaviors as well that almost incentivize that. And for me, you kind of realize through reading that how important, as you mentioned, also a free market is. So why do you think, and we'll get back to Bitcoin in a bit, but I also know you have a lot of knowledge about just macroeconomics and monetary history. So why do you think a free market is so important to a well-functioning society?
For sure. And I think it's a really profound question because I do believe that those in positions of power, and this may be a bit more of a, what's the word? A contrarian belief, but I don't believe there are heinous people out there. I believe people are self-interested, and even those that end up committing heinous acts believe what they're doing is right. And so to give obviously the extreme example of that, although I fully disagree with what happened during World War II, I think Hitler believed what he was doing was right. And so I think that there aren't evil people out there. There's just people that are misaligned and misunderstand the world around them. And so with that in mind, I do believe that central bankers, those in positions of power, I don't think they are intentionally trying to make life harder and to just slam the middle and lower class. I think they are trying to intervene in a way that supports people, that supports businesses, that supports growth, because that's the incentives of the system. But unfortunately, that intervention results in a whole heap of byproducts that actually makes life a hell of a lot harder. And so intervention is one of these things where I think humans have the hubris to believe that when we intervene, we can think about all of the knock-on effects of that intervention. And to give you a couple of examples, so I think it was in the 1970s, Yellowstone National Park in the US, they had a wolf problem. The general populace surrounding Yellowstone were just like, you know what, we need to cull the wolves. We need to remove the wolves from Yellowstone National Park. So what do? They went and killed all the wolves in Yellowstone National Park. Now, what they didn't think about is, well, the wolves go and kill the deer. And the deer, all of a sudden, start to flourish. So deer just go wild. Well, the deer are now eating all of the ground shrubbery. Anytime you get a new little tree sprouting up from the ground, they go and eat it. And so suddenly, all of the lower brush at the base of the floor of the forest just starts getting eaten up. Now, that brush is important because that brush, the roots go down into the soil and they stabilize the soil. So because there was no roots stabilizing the soil, the rivers coming through Yellowstone National Park started to erode the banks of kind of the grassy banks and the muddy banks, and they all started to erode and collapse. So the rivers actually changed course and completely changed the landscape of Yellowstone National Park, which you start to realize, just by removing one small little feature of this ecosystem, the wolves, you impact what this natural ecosystem looks like. And the same thing is true like with Nike and shoes. I read this story, and it could be Nike, it could be someone else, I can't quite remember. But there was a story way back when where in Africa, Nike decided, hey, we want to help this population by donating something like 100 million pairs of shoes or a few million pairs of shoes to Africa to support people that aren't maybe able to go and buy shoes. So they donated all of these shoes thinking they're supporting these communities. But what ends up happening is by donating all of these shoes, well, no one is buying shoes. So all the shoemakers go out of business. And then a year later, once people have worn through all of the shoes, then suddenly people go to try and buy shoes, but there's no shoemakers. So now they're worse off than when they started. And so it kind of gets to that point where I think sometimes we have the hubris to believe that intervention is right. Intervention is what we need, but it's very impulsive. We're acting on our immediate needs, not thinking about the long-term detrimental effects of this intervention. And to kind of really push it home, in my book, The Hidden Cost of Money, I describe why intervention is not the answer. And it's kind of through kind of a 4-stage process. And the first stage is that we have a misalignment to reality. And on a big grand scale, macroeconomic scale, I'll give you an example. The reason why we have a misalignment to reality is we're taking out debt and we're pumping money into the economy and we're seeing prices rise. The reality, as Jeff Booth talks about in his book, The Price of Tomorrow, is that prices actually should fall over time because humans have always been striving to get more for less. We've always been trying to push to increase productivity, increase efficiency. And so through innovation and technological advancement, prices should be falling. And if you just take like Netflix versus Blockbuster, with Blockbuster, you used to have to drive down to Blockbuster. You're expending time and energy and gas. And then you get to Blockbuster, you spend half an hour in Blockbuster, you rent the movie, and then you drive all the way back home, you watch the movie, you drive all the way back again, you drop the movie back again. And so all of that time and energy to watch one movie. And now we have Netflix for almost the same price as a movie. And we've got millions of movies at our fingertips. And so that's just one example, but it's showing you how prices over time are falling. It's the same thing with farming. You used to have to do everything by hand. So you'd have tons and tons of labor hours, hundreds of people trying to till the soil and plant the crops and pick the crops. And now you have a machinery that can just drive over and do the work of 100 people in a fraction of the time. So prices should be falling, but they're not. And so we have this misalignment to reality to start. Our prices are rising while the reality is that prices should be falling. Now, why is that happening? The problem is when we have a debt-based system, when we borrow beyond our means, if all of these big corporations have borrowed beyond their means, they've got a lot of debt service payments, they've got to service their debt, pay interest, you name it. If prices start falling, well, it's going to start squeezing their margins. Their income is going to decline. So if their income is declining while they've got to service these debt payments, well, the system starts collapsing. And so ultimately, we have this incentive in society, given how much debt we have, to intervene. And so this intervention results in those in positions of power pumping capital into the economy and bailing out these businesses. But that capital ends up creating inflation. Prices start rising. So we have this misalignment reality. That's the first stage, misalignment reality. Now, the next one is death of creative destruction. And what I mean by this is, okay, so you've now got all of these businesses that have borrowed beyond their means, and they should wither away because they can't support their debt service payments. But then the government steps in and pumps capital and supports and props up these fiscally irresponsible, unproductive businesses. So now what does that say to all of the businesses that have been responsible, that have borrowed within their means, and they're able to support themselves? Well, all of a sudden, instead of being able to direct capital towards innovation, towards growth, they now have to direct capital towards competition, competing against companies that should not exist. And so ultimately, you've broken down the tendency of a free market to allow creative destruction to take place. You're allowing businesses that offer value to rise to the top. That doesn't happen anymore. You're bailing out businesses that are fiscally irresponsible. So we don't know what businesses should exist and what businesses shouldn't because we don't have transparency because of intervention. That leads us to the third stage, which is cash flow distortion. If all of a sudden money is no longer flowing to where value is being created because companies that are meant to wither away are not withering away, then all of a sudden capital in society is flowing to unproductive areas of society. And that kind of leads us to kind of the fourth stage, which is decision-making impairment. How can we, as individuals, how can central planners, how can businessmen, how can politicians, how can we make decisions if we don't know what businesses are offering value, what businesses are not offering value, what businesses should survive, what businesses shouldn't survive, what industries are really there because people are directing capital towards them, and what industries are just there because of intervention and stimulus? And so all of a sudden, it's completely decimated society because we're very unproductive in capital flow because we have no idea what should exist and what shouldn't exist. And so this kind of these four stages really just highlight why intervention is not the answer. A free market allows value to rise up that ends up benefiting all of us. If there is an industry and you decide as an individual, hey, I'm going to go into this industry and I'm going to create this business because I think people want this business. Well, what happens? All of a sudden, if what it is that you offer, your service, your product, is what people want, then capital flows towards you and your business thrives. But if what you offer does not meet the needs of the consumer, then no capital is going to flow towards you, and you're going to quickly have to pivot, and you're going to have to offer value in some other way. And so what the free market does is it forces competition. It forces people to pivot and to offer value to society, which that value ends up benefiting everyone. Because if you create a product, if you innovate, if you increase efficiency, productivity, then you outcompete another business, and that value rises up and everyone benefits from that. And so ultimately, I'm very pro free market and removing a lot of intervention because I think that humans, unfortunately, struggle to think about the second, third, and fourth order effects of when we intervene. What are the byproducts of this? Anyway, that's a long-winded approach as to why the free market.
No, but it's a very well explained answer, and there's a lot to unpack there because, as you said, it does have a lot of implications throughout society when you do not have a free market and you have constant, government intervention. And to go to that next step, so you just outlined, these problems of government intervention and centralized planning, and I agree with you. I try to also I try not to think too negatively about the people, and I think people generally, for the most part, I mean, there's some bad people out there, but I think people are, for the most part, well-intentioned, but it's all depending on what your incentives are as well, right? So especially, politicians, they're incentivized to keep the public happy. And, especially, for example, in COVID time, when you would think a lot of businesses would probably fail because, people are inside and people aren't able to consume in the way that they normally do, and people are scared and they're more conservative because they're unsure of the future. You would think that those are times when, stock markets go down and you just have an economic crisis. And I think we saw the opposite during 2020, right? Equity markets roared. I mean, Bitcoin roared as well. All assets pretty much roared as well. And that for me also was kind of a clicking point where I'm like, wait, this doesn't match up, because in my eyes, we're living through one of arguably the, most impactful crises in my life, a global pandemic. But yet the signals that I'm getting from the market and from economics tell me otherwise. And then you go and you're like, wait, okay, it's because they just injected, trillions of dollars into the global economy that this is the case. And, politicians, they're in a way incentivized to do that, to keep the public happy, to keep people on the surface thinking that things are okay. But because you don't let the natural market kind of, have its effect, and while there may be more short-term pain in some of those proceedings, in the long term, it creates a healthier environment, right? And so for me, that then, because 2020 was also a pivotal moment for me when I really started to go deeper into the Bitcoin rabbit hole. But why do you think that, based off of everything you just said and we just discussed, how do you think Bitcoin fixes these issues?
That's the biggest question. And that question is a bottomless rabbit hole. I would say, if I was to distill it down, we have never had a technology up until this point that has allowed us to remove money from state. Unfortunately, when we look at gold, given that it is physical in nature, it is tangible, means that, okay, well, if I want to store my gold, I've got to find some place to physically store that. If we have to physically store it, first off, it is prone to seizure. Someone can seize that gold, or it can be stolen very, very easily. And secondly, a lot of people, if you want to save large amounts of value in gold, all of a sudden it becomes very cumbersome. How are you going to store this? So what ends up happening over history is that people would rely on banks and holding houses to store their gold. So by storing their gold in a central entity, well, all of a sudden that central entity realized very quickly over thousands or hundreds of years, these people are not coming back to retrieve their gold. I wonder if we can start to issue kind of gold receipts and people can start to trade those gold receipts. And then what ends up happening is we had a gold-backed currency. People started using the currency, the currency backed by gold as a medium of exchange rather than the gold itself. And then that transitioned to, okay, well, these deposit institutions, these centralized entities, no one is coming back for their gold. So why don't we just issue more receipts than there are gold in our vaults? And so this is when we started to have a leverage system. We had a system with fractional reserves. We only had 10, 20, 30% of the reserves held in custody based on how much money is actually issued. And so the system started to break down. The system started to create its own instability, its own structural issues. And so gold, unfortunately, being physical in nature, does not meet the need of a true sound money that is able to support people globally. And so all of a sudden, when Bitcoin came out, which is Satoshi, it was kind of his vision, is how do we separate money from state? How do we create a digital money that meets the needs of the users, that is decentralized, removes any intermediaries, any third parties? Well, Bitcoin, all of a sudden, we have a peer-to-peer exchange. So it's as if we're doing a cash transaction, but we can be sending money from here to China. And that is profound. You can send money without intermediaries globally, and it's something that we've never had before. And not only that, but we can take custody of it. We can take custody of it in 12 to 24 words. In our head, I could walk across a border, start naked, with all of my value in my head, and no one has any idea that it is there. And so what that means is that all of a sudden, it is very hard to seize. And so it's very hard to seize. It starts to flip all of the incentives globally. And this is something that I think is truly profound, is every single asset that we've ever had throughout history has either been tangible, it's been physical, like gold, or like property, or like diamonds, you name it. The problem with that, as I mentioned, is it can be seized very easily. When it comes to property, our physical location can be seized very easily. Or we have digital assets like bonds, equities, any of these financial instruments, these derivatives, these financial products. But the problem with that is you cannot self-custody them. They're held by third parties. And so again, if the government wants to come down hard, they can seize those assets. So what that means is every asset that we've had up until this point has been very, very hard to ensure its stability and its integrity moving forward, as in we can hold on to it. And so Bitcoin, for the first time in history, allows us to do that. We can take custody of this asset and we can move around freely without anyone knowing that we have this asset. What that does is it realigns the incentives in society, because if you've got this asset that people are able to store capital in without the government being able to seize it very easily, well, the only way for the government to be able to obtain Bitcoin is then to offer value. So if it offers value, then we willingly, voluntarily hand over that Bitcoin to pay taxes, hand over that Bitcoin for whatever other reasons. And so by flipping the incentives from seizure to cooperation, that's massive. We've never had that throughout history. And so then it forces a free market where governments and nations now have to compete. because capital is going to flow to where value is being created. If a nation state is not offering value, then people can quickly move capital abroad. They can then move by effectively just moving location, and capital is going to flee the nation that is not offering value and move towards the nation that is. And so it forces competition, it forces a free market, and it forces value creation. And so when it comes to Bitcoin, kind of to simplify that, what I think is profound about Bitcoin is it separates money from state. It forces the government to become a free market entity. It forces them to act like any other business in society. If they want to obtain capital, they have to offer value. If they do not offer value, then they wither away. At the moment, that's not the case. If the government wants to do whatever it is that it wants, it can simply print money at the expense of currency holders. And that's a problem because it doesn't actually have accountability. It doesn't have to support its populace.
Yeah, well said. And I think you make some key points there, one of which is, I'd be curious to hear your opinion on this, because I think, as you mentioned, Bitcoin is very powerful in that now we have technology that separates money and state, which is very, very fundamental. But I think a byproduct of that, right, is you have states who are, they have a lot of power, they have a lot of control. And typically people who do have a lot of power, who do have a lot of control, it's not that they give it up very lightly most of the time, right? It's not oftentimes that it's a very, let's say, peaceful transition. And so that's something that I also try to battle with a bit myself, because I do see Bitcoin as a peaceful revolution. People like you and myself, you kind of opt out of the traditional fiat system by buying Bitcoin and holding Bitcoin. But I think once it gets to a scale where nation states start paying attention, I think you'll kind of have different levels of reactions where maybe you have certain countries who can advantage from that, like in El Salvador, that's adopting it as its legal tender and is making strides there. But then I wonder countries like the US or countries in Europe or let's say Russia, for example, whose power also stems from their ability to control the money. How do you see that going forward? Do you think it will be a peaceful revolution, or do you see a lot of turmoil in that transition, let's say?
I would say that, and it's a really, really good question because it's tough. We cannot obviously predict the future. I would say that wars are never going to totally disappear. Wars are always going to happen, given that there's always going to be conflict. People have differing opinions. The first thing I'll say is that under a sound money system such as Bitcoin, let's just say we're living in a world where Bitcoin was adopted globally. Most nations globally were using Bitcoin. What is amazing about that is if a war is to happen, first you need support from the populace. Because if you don't have support from the populace and the populace stops paying taxes, then all of a sudden you're not going to be able to have capital to fund yourself and you're going to wither away. And so secondly, first, that means that in order for war to happen, the populace has to be behind it. That's huge. It means that we're actually building the populace into our consensus mechanism. Our voting system doesn't really work. Most of these leaders are ruling through dictatorial means. That's the word, dictatorial. It's a mixture of dictator and Anyway, they're acting on very dictatorial means by, like during the pandemic here in Whistler, Trudeau effectively ran office without necessarily ever meeting with the other politicians, ever actually having an informed discussion. And that's a problem. And so I think that when it comes to Bitcoin, it means that you have the populace on side. And so when it comes to war, that means that you have to have people on side to be able to fund war. But secondly, it means that if you want to go to war, you have to save. So if you're saving to go to war, you're building up reserves to go to war. If you suddenly do go to war and you realize, hey, man, we're getting smoked here, we're losing a lot of casualties, it doesn't allow us to continue funding war endlessly, which we can do with the fiat machine. We can continue funding war at the expense of the currency holders by debasement. On a Bitcoin standard, that's not possible. And so the moment you start to realize, hey, I don't think there's a chance of us winning, well, then we're going to withdraw or we're going to give in. And that means wars are going to be a lot shorter. There's going to be a lot less casualties to it. But to your point, which is kind of more in alignment with your question, which is, what about these nation states that are benefiting immensely from fiat currencies? Are they not going to go down without a fight? And 100%. They're going to fight hard. And we're already starting to see that. You start to see people like Elizabeth Warren in the States put through a lot of, trying to put through bills that really do kneecap self-sovereignty. They want people who are buying Bitcoin to be buying the ETF, let alone they tried to stop the ETF from even going through. And so what they're really trying to do is impact people's ability to have sovereignty. Because all of a sudden, if people are buying Bitcoin through ETF means or through any of these other digital products, well, the government can seize them easily. That means that it removes all of Bitcoin's utility outside of its economic benefit of the price going up. And so we're going to see a lot of bills put through, I think, over the next few years that are going to severely impact our ability as Bitcoiners to take custody of our Bitcoin, which is why it is very important, and I urge anyone listening to this, to take custody of your Bitcoin. Because ultimately, if you've just got an ETF or you've got some other financial product backed by Bitcoin and you're holding MicroStrategy shares, that's awesome. You may be benefiting from Bitcoin's price action, but you don't benefit from any of the other utility that Bitcoin offers, such as a peer-to-peer medium exchange, a trustless medium exchange, a permissionless medium exchange. And so that's where I really highly recommend people buying Bitcoin, because it is also Bitcoin that allows us to, if your government doesn't offer value, then you're able to move, you're able to flee without necessarily the oversight and the seizure potential that a lot of these traditional assets hold. And so kind of to your point, I 100% believe that we will see a lot more intervention from governments to try and impact our ability to transition to a Bitcoin standard. But in the long run, what I think Bitcoin does is it allows us to take custody of our assets. It allows capital to flow to where value is being created. So if people value what's happening in El Salvador, more capital is going to flow towards El Salvador and away from these fiat nations that are not offering value to society. And if that happens, well, those nations will slowly over time, it will diminish their ability to continue doing what it is that they're doing. And so in the long run, it realigns those incentives towards value creation.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's a very interesting time because, we see it kind of playing out now as well with a bit of like the global game theory where we do see, it's going to be initially smaller countries like El Salvador, but now also in Argentina, we just elected a president who's appears to be well knowledgeable about economics and Bitcoin also. And so I think we're going to see this play out, on a bit more of a global scale. And I do also think you made an important point with regards to self-sovereignty, because that's such an important part of Bitcoin. But I do think it's also one of the more difficult things because nowadays it's not I struggle sometimes because I believe fundamentally in the power of sovereignty and having control of your money, having control of your life, of course. But I think it's not something, especially as it relates to money, that people are used to because most people nowadays interact with money through a bank. Cash is becoming obsolete, and any asset essentially outside of maybe real estate or physical gold or watches or anything like that, it's online, on a brokerage account, your equities or, cash that you have is custodied by a bank. And so for me, there's still this big obstacle where people aren't primed at the moment towards, radical self-responsibility and self-sovereignty because I think it's not what we're used to at the moment. And for me initially too, when I first started with Bitcoin, I didn't know the difference between a hardware and a software wallet. And then slowly and surely, I obviously learned more. I took custody of my Bitcoin. I understood the real reasons why you need to do that. But it is a difficult concept. And that's something that I think will be an obstacle as we progress, through the adoption of Bitcoin, is how do we get people to take self-sovereignty of their Bitcoin, to not just buy an ETF because, that gives them exposure to the price. So how do you see this developing? Like, how do you think we as Bitcoiners can also get people there and not just get them to buy the ETF or buy Bitcoin and leave it on Coinbase, but to take that next step and also, actually take self-sovereignty of their money and of their Bitcoin?
You know what? I think this will be the biggest question of the next 10 years in Bitcoin's evolution is how do we maintain Bitcoin's incredible benefits, such as its self-sovereignty, its permissionless, trustless capabilities, and ensure that the majority of people buying Bitcoin are buying Bitcoin. They're not buying the Bitcoin ETF or any of these other financial products. And so it's interesting you say that, because so about 4 or 5 years ago, myself, Greg Foss, my business partner Daz, and another couple others, we founded an educational website called Looking Glass Education. And Looking Glass Education, our whole goal was to speak to the layperson, the working individual, the blue-collar worker, about why Bitcoin and why we're facing the issues that we're facing in society. And all of our content is free. We've got a ton of different courses. You can just check it out at lookingglasseducation.com. But about a year ago, we decided, you know what, we want to be able to support more people in their custody solution. And so we created this product called Coddle, which is kind of a play on kind of hodl and coddling your child. It's kind of the overprotective approach to self-custody. And what we realized very quickly, we're sitting in on these meetings with Bitcoiners, some of them incredibly knowledgeable, and they do not have the technical prowess and the technical capability to take custody of their Bitcoin. And so when it comes to buying a hardware wallet, downloading the software, saving your seed phrase, what happens if you live in an apartment? What happens if, like, where do you store your seed phrase so that it's secure? What happens if you've got roommates? What happens? There's so many questions that make it really hard to really be truly self-sovereign, that it really made us question, is pure self-custody, like having a single signature wallet or setting up your own multi-signature wallet, now dealing with 3 keys and the config file, is that really a way that we can move forward and get billions of people globally? And the answer that we kind of came to is that I don't think it's possible. I don't think pure self-custody is possible. And so that's where we ended up partnering with a company out of Australia called the Bitcoin Advisor. And the Bitcoin Advisor basically does collaborative custody. And we believe that collaborative custody, from our own experience, and this is from going down the rabbit hole, trying to take self-custody, we self-custody our own assets, and then trying to support others in that journey and realizing that maybe they don't have the technical capability to do so. We realize that collaborative custody is kind of a hybrid between the two. And let's just say you've got a multi-signature wallet. So there's 3 keys, and you need any 2 of those 3 keys to be able to move funds. What you would do is you as an individual would hold 1 key. The Bitcoin Advisor in Australia would hold another key. And then the vault provider, the person who sets up the vault, if you're in the States, many people use Unchained, would hold another key. So now that means that if any single entity was to go under, let's just say Unchained was to go insolvent, or the US government was to seize Unchained, well, all of a sudden, it doesn't matter, because there's still 2 of the 3 keys with the Bitcoin Advisor and yourself, so that you'd be able to move funds. But that also means that if you as an individual, you lose your key, your house burns down, all of a sudden you cannot access your key, well, you reach out to the Bitcoin Advisor, there's still 2 keys remaining and they can move funds. And so the way that I see it personally is that collaborative custody is a way to be able to minimize the risk of personal key loss, while also minimizing any centralized custodian risk. And you also get the benefit of, you've got estate planning. In the event that you were to pass on, and your next of kin, your partner, your kids don't know how to access your key, well, then they can reach out to the Bitcoin Advisor and they can move funds, disperse them however you've kind of dictated in your will. And so what I personally have kind of gone down this whole route is, of course, if someone is listening to this and they have the technical expertise to go deep into self-custody, absolutely 100%, go do that. I absolutely commend anyone who wants to take self-custody of their Bitcoin. But for the average person, I would say it's a little too complex, and there's also quite a high probability of potential key loss or making a mistake setting up. And that's where I do believe that collaborative custody is kind of a hybrid solution between the 2 of them. And if anyone is interested, you feel free to reach out just on Twitter, Seb Bunney or The Looking Glass, and we're more than happy to just go through an initial consultation to talk about that. But that's what I genuinely believe, is that in order for Bitcoin to be able to compete with the fiat world, what it does incredibly well is user experience. They make it very easy for people to be able to move funds, to be able to access things. The problem with the ease of use is that it also comes with relying with centralized entities, relying on custodians. And that's when, are these assets really your assets? Which, as we've seen with the trucker rally in Canada during the pandemic, the moment you stand up against the institution, well, then they freeze your bank accounts and you can't access your funds. Or as we saw in Greece in 2014, when Greece went under, they froze everyone's bank accounts and they took 50% of everyone's bank accounts to fund the government. So you start to realize, you're like, my God, this is wild. Like, is the money that's in our bank really in our bank? And so that's why I wouldn't rely on a custodian. But if you don't have the expertise to do self-custody, that's totally okay. There's these middle ground ideas, collaborative custody. And what's really cool is in the future, we're going to be able to prove that there could be no potential collusion between any of the key holders through things such as what's called like a decaying multisig, but I won't go too deep into that.
Yeah, no, but I appreciate that answer, and I think the multi-sig collaborative custody model is one of the more accessible and scalable models, and I think that'll definitely play a big role in Bitcoin's adoption. I still struggle sometimes a bit because I've tested everything from the single sig hardware wallets to Unchained to Casa to a few other of the multi-sig providers, and they're great. They really are. But I do still, I like you said, right? I still try to picture like, okay, can I see 8 billion people doing this? And I do think Bitcoin nowadays is like the internet in the 90s, right? When it was like you probably couldn't have imagined Instagram or anything like that when the internet first started, or any of the other beautiful innovations that came out of the internet. So I think there will be a lot of more solutions on top of including multi-sig, but on top of that to make it more accessible. Ideally, I think we'd live in a world where you have a Bitcoin wallet that's on your phone that's as secure as like a hardware wallet, where you don't have a third party intermediary that can dilute or lose your funds. And I think we'll get there, but I think it's interesting to always talk to people in the space on kind of their vision and what they see with it. And, we also have things like Fedimint, which are, coming up. And so, yeah, that's all to say. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. But I totally agree with you that multi-sig collaborative custody is, for me, what I recommend to any friends who are kind of looking to take self custody of their Bitcoin, because you do still have a third party, except they don't have like the full control of your Bitcoin, right? You have the benefits of both. So on top of that, I wanted to ask you, so I think custodying Bitcoin is, a challenge that we'll have to figure out innovative solutions to maintain Bitcoin and not just have it be like a fractional reserve Bitcoin system. But are there any other things that you see right now that are, maybe challenges to Bitcoin's adoption or opportunities to improve upon within the space?
That's a good question. Well, you know what, if I was to slightly reframe the question, that I always think it's an interesting question. People sometimes ask, what do you think the biggest threat to Bitcoin is? And the biggest threat to Bitcoin, I think, is a really interesting question, because there's a quote at the start of The Big Short, which says, "It's not what you know that gets you in trouble, it's what you don't know that just ain't so." And basically what they're saying is, many times we think we can anticipate all of the potential outcomes of these big events, and we think we know what the major threats are to Bitcoin. And actually, what I think the major threats are to Bitcoin is actually us Bitcoiners and the developers who are making changes to Bitcoin. And so we don't necessarily know that if we make a change to Bitcoin, a small, minute little change that is supposedly meant to improve X, Y, and Z, sometimes we can't extrapolate how that change can ultimately impact how people use Bitcoin. And so we've seen it with Taproot and SegWit, the introduction of things like ordinals. Well, ordinals, now, whether or not you agree with ordinals, we saw huge bloating of the the memory pool, and fees absolutely skyrocketed. Now, people were very scared for a moment. Is this going to impact Bitcoin? Is this going to impact the functionality of Bitcoin? And now we've recognized, no, we're just going to have higher fee environments when there's a lot of demand for ordinals. But you can see how our idea trying to change Bitcoin on a minute little scale and introduce certain aspects leads to these byproducts. People then use Bitcoin in different ways. And so I think that the ultimate risk that we face to Bitcoin is actually through the changing of Bitcoin. But then the other thing is that I should say is that people like the world to be black and white. We like to say, okay, well, should we change Bitcoin or should we not change Bitcoin? The reality is I don't think that we should say, okay, we're never going to change Bitcoin, because we also still have to protect ourselves against what happens if quantum computing can start to hack SHA-256. Well, now we've got to change SHA-256. We've got to have something that's got a higher encryption level. Well, ultimately, we have to be able to change and adapt to the changing environment, but we've got to minimize the amount at which we change, because change is also, sorry, my dog's shaking in the background, but you're also finding out that changes impact our ability to move forward and that people can take advantage of those changes. And so I think the biggest threat to Bitcoin is actually us as Bitcoiners. It's us as, I'm not a developer myself, but developers and changes to the Bitcoin code.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting viewpoint. I think so as well, because I think it's a very fragile thing, right? We have this beautiful technology, but there's I think always a human want to improve upon things and to innovate. I think that's just something natural. But like you said, we have to be careful that our innovations don't end up stifling the thing that we do really care about. So I think that's well said. And one of my final questions is we just had the halving, so a lot of people are typically the halving correlates to bull markets, and I think given also just the election that's coming up and everything we've seen there, and I think all signs point to probably another influx of new Bitcoiners or people this cycle. So for the people entering the space, because it can be overwhelming in the beginning, there's a lot of information, a lot of also different cryptocurrencies out there. So what is your advice to new people getting into the space? Yeah.
I would say that when it comes to Bitcoin, and this is the same for any financial advice, is many times when we see this asset that has performed incredibly well in the past, we go full hog into it. We invest 10, 20, 30, 40, 50+% of our net worth into this thing. And all of a sudden then it starts to pull back. And Bitcoin, the reality is that Bitcoin, because of its early on in its adoption, and we're seeing capital funnel in from all of these different sources, Bitcoin's price can be incredibly volatile. And so expect, this has happened in every single past cycle, expect whenever we do peak, and I don't know what that price will be, expect a 70 to 80% drawdown. So if you've invested at $100, then expect that $100 to drop down to around $20. And that's just what you should expect going into this. And so that's where I really recommend whatever it is that people put into this, don't leverage yourself into Bitcoin. That will inevitably end up in blowing up because you won't be able to support the position. And secondly, whatever it is that you invest into Bitcoin, have the understanding that, hey, it's going to get incredibly volatile, which is why you need to dig in and understand this thing outside of it being just a financial asset. And so for me personally, what I recommend is we, for the majority, look at the world through the lens of fiat currencies, where prices rise, cost of living gets harder, and most people look at Bitcoin through that same lens. They're looking at this asset, which they just want it to go up in value to sell it and then try and ease their fiat lifestyle. Whereas when you actually start looking at the world through the lens of Bitcoin, when you start thinking in Bitcoin as a unit of account, you start to realize actually that prices fall in relation to Bitcoin. Life gets easier. Cost of living gets easier. That is profound. And so what I recommend is really trying to dig deep into Bitcoin and recognizing, how does it impact you? How does money impact our relationships? How does it impact our social life, our ability to support our kids? All of these big questions, because when you start doing that, you start to look at the world through the lens of Bitcoin. When you look at the world through the lens of Bitcoin, life gets a hell of a lot easier, but it also helps you through these tough times. When Bitcoin's price is super volatile, Bitcoin's price is collapsing, it helps you move through those periods, recognizing that, hey, this will pass. And this is part of the journey of Bitcoin, is being able to deal with this price volatility. And arguably that price volatility, those big drawdowns, is what gives me more kind of strength and to maintain it through the bull run, because you realize there's a diamond at the end of this rainbow, a bag of gold at the end of this rainbow. And so it's all of this is a journey, and it's a fun journey. It's a hard journey, but it's fun.
Yeah, very well said. I think I agree with you there. And I had Jimmy Song on as well for the podcast, and his advice was very similar. And I think a lot of Bitcoiners, because I think sometimes, you look at some Bitcoiners who've maybe been in the space for a while and have made a lot of money, and you think, oh, you're so lucky, you got into Bitcoin early and this. But then you realize the people who have bought early and have held, it takes so much conviction and so much effort to do so, because it's not easy. I've also experienced the 80% drawdown, and many people were saying I was crazy for not selling earlier and all this stuff. But I think once you understand the fundamental underlying technology, and as long as nothing changes within that underlying value proposition, I think it's one of the safest bets you can make. But to understand that value proposition takes time. It takes learning. It takes a lot of the educational work you're doing as well with Looking Glass and your new book. You have to take time to read and to understand to be able to kind of survive these drawdowns.
I couldn't agree more. And I was going to add one point quickly, which is I think a lot of people, they see Bitcoin's volatility and they think, oh man, Bitcoin is incredibly volatile. Bitcoin's volatility is not a result of Bitcoin. Bitcoin's volatility is a result of the fiat currency system. And so when you have a fiat system where you have central planners easing monetary policy, as in moving money into the economy, printing money, lowering interest rates to increase borrowing, all of a sudden capital floods into Bitcoin. Bitcoin's price skyrockets. When you have central bankers tightening, so that means raising interest rates, impacting people's ability to borrow, all of a sudden you have money fleeing Bitcoin back into fiat. And so what ends up happening is that people think Bitcoin's volatility is a flaw of Bitcoin. Bitcoin's volatility is actually just highlighting how broken the underlying system is, that people are having to constantly hedge against fiat. Oh no, I've got to move back into fiat. And you actually saw when we were on a gold standard, gold was a lot more stable. The moment we moved off the gold standard into a fiat standard, gold became incredibly volatile. That's not because gold is volatile. It's just highlighting that fiat is volatile. And so I find it interesting because Bitcoin's volatility is actually just highlighting how broken our current system is, not anything to do with Bitcoin.
Agreed, fully agreed. And I think there's much more that we could go to in here from a lot of things that you said. But for that, you have an incredible book that you wrote recently. You also have Looking Glass, where there's a lot of great educational content. You also did some other long form podcasts with other prominent Bitcoiners. So I highly suggest my listeners, if they're interested to hear more about any of what we've just discussed, you go into it in quite a bit more detail in those resources. But where else can my listeners, find you, learn more about the work that it is that you're doing, or just get in touch?
For sure. And I just want to say, Stephan, I really appreciate you having me on. It's been such a pleasure talking. And it's always, as I mentioned at the start, nice to meet like-minded individuals, and hopefully we can meet in person one day. But I would say, so you can jump on lookingglasseducation.com, and all of our content is kind of free and accessible. And then you can also check out The Hidden Cost of Money, which is the book that I wrote, released in December, and I've just been humbled by the response. And that book you'll be able to just find on Amazon. Or I always want to make sure that if someone cannot afford something, feel free to just fire me a message on Twitter, or just reach out to me on my own website, sebbunny.com, and Bunny is Bunney. And I'll give you the ebook for free if you can't afford the book, because I want to make sure that price is not a burden or a barrier to someone being able to learn. And so, Looking Glass Education, or sebbunny.com, and Seb Bunney on Twitter.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate you doing all of that, and I'll put that all in the show notes for my listeners as well. But Seb, thanks again so much for your time. It was honestly a pleasure.
It's my pleasure. Thanks a lot, Stephan.